December 1944, a Third Army evacuation hospital near Arlon, Belgium. Snow piles against the canvas walls. The air inside smells of ether and wet wool. In a narrow, drafty hallway, Staff Sergeant Calvin Simmons lies on a low stretcher. A chest wound seeps through his heavy bandages. He shivers in the biting cold. 20 feet away, behind a pair of heavy doors, 7 heated beds sit empty. They are perfectly white. They are perfectly made. But Simmons cannot have one. The colored ward is full. The hallway is the only place for a man of his rank and race. It is a quiet, bureaucratic cruelty. General George S. Patton is coming to these wards. When he sees the empty beds and the men left in the alley, he will ensure the man responsible learns exactly what it feels like to be treated like a discarded box. This is the story of what General Patton did when wounded soldiers were left to suffer in freezing hallways while empty, heated beds sat behind a whites-only sign. It is a chronicle of a commander who refused to let bureaucracy override the basic survival of his men. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when dignity was denied and then restored. Nurse Lieutenant Margaret Reeves was 25 years old. She came from the brick streets of Boston, Massachusetts. She served with the surgical teams of the evacuation hospital near Arlon. Margaret grew up in a cramped brownstone in the South End. Her father was a surgeon who died during the Great Flu of 1918 while treating the poor. She watched him work until his own lungs failed. She enlisted in the Army Nurse Corps in 1942 because she knew what it meant to fight for breath in a cold room. By December 1944, she had seen enough shrapnel, torn limbs, and gangrene to last a lifetime. She had seen the way the Ardennes winter turned a minor puncture into a quick death. She was a woman of hard facts and clean bandages. She had already been formally reprimanded once for moving a dying man into a warm ward without Greer's permission. Now, she stood in the drafty corridor and watched the frost form on the wool blanket of a man with a jagged hole in his chest. Captain Ernest Greer was 38 years old. He was the hospital administrator from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Greer was a man of rigid policy and pristine paper. He believed that the United States Army functioned best when it mirrored the social hierarchies of the world back home. He often told his junior staff that a field hospital was no place for social experiments, and that order was more important than the individual. He wore a pair of brown service shoes, so highly polished they reflected the dim light of the surgery lamps. Those shoes had never stepped in a muddy foxhole. They had never been soaked in the freezing slush of the Belgian woods. Greer kept the white ward pristine and half-empty to ensure that incoming white officers always found a quiet, heated space. He viewed the colored ward as a secondary machine. When that machine ran out of room, he simply moved the excess men into the hallway like unwanted freight. He saw the dying sergeant on the floor not as a soldier, but as a clerical error. In December 1944, the Ardennes forest was a frozen killing ground. The German army had punched a massive hole through the Allied lines. It was the start of the Battle of the Bulge. Thousands of American men were falling in the deep snow. The roads were clogged with burning tanks and retreating trucks. Logistics were failing. Every evacuation hospital in Belgium was bursting at the seams. Surgeons worked for 48 hours straight until they dropped. In this chaos, many officers retreated into the rules they knew best. They sought order in a world that was falling apart. The U.S. Army was a segregated machine. The War Department had strict codes for housing and care. Most commanders in the Third Army did not question these codes. They had a war to win. They saw the separation of black and white soldiers as a logistics hurdle. If the designated ward for black soldiers was full, the procedure was to wait for a bed to clear. Other administrators across Europe let this slide every day. They ignored the drafts. They ignored the lack of heat. They focused on their quotas and their paperwork. They believed that maintaining the old social order was a vital part of military discipline. The weather was a weapon. The temperature dropped below zero every night. Water in the canteens froze solid. Inside the tents and stone buildings, the real battle was against sepsis and pneumonia. A chest wound was a death sentence if the patient could not stay warm. Yet, the bureaucracy remained frozen. Commanders did not want to upset the status quo while the front line was collapsing. They looked the other way, while men who had bled for the same flag were sorted like mail into different piles. In the drafty corridor, the moisture from Sergeant Simmons' breath turned to ice on his blanket. The infection was already taking hold in the dark. The hospital near Arlon remained silent, except for the low moan of the wind and the coughing in the hallway. Lieutenant Reeves walked into the administration office. The air was warm. It smelled of coffee and sweet pipe tobacco. Captain Greer sat behind a mahogany desk. He was reviewing a stack of requisitions. His boots shone in the lamplight like black glass. "Captain, Sergeant Simmons has a fever of 104. Reeves said. Greer did not look up from his papers. "The man in the hallway?" "Yes, sir. He is shivering so hard he is tearing his chest stitches. The cold is killing him. The colored ward is at capacity, Lieutenant. I have already explained this 3 times today. The white ward has 7 empty beds. They have been empty for 3 days. The heaters are running in there." Greer put down his pen and looked at her. "Those beds are reserved for the 101st and the 4th Armored. The 101st isn't coming here, sir. They have their own clearing stations further north. They are reserved for white soldiers. Reeves, that is the hospital policy. It is my policy. Army regulations state that emergency care and life-saving measures take precedence over housing logistics. I am the administrator. I decide what is an emergency and what is a logistics matter. The man has a perforated lung. He will be dead by morning if he stays in that drafty corridor." Greer leaned back in his leather chair. Then he should have been more careful in the woods. He was hit while dragging a wounded white lieutenant to safety under mortar fire. It doesn't matter if he dragged the King of England through the mud. He stays in the hall. "Sir, it is 12 degrees outside. The door to the loading dock is 5 feet from his stretcher. I told you, the white ward is for white men. I won't have my boys waking up next to a colored private. He's a staff sergeant, sir. He has more time in grade than most of the men in that ward. He's a colored boy who belongs in a colored bed. If there are no beds, he stays in the alley." Greer tapped his desk with a perfectly manicured fingernail. "I won't let you clutter up my clean wards with people who simply don't belong there. This is medical malpractice, Captain. It is a violation of your oath. This is the United States Army. There is an order to things, and I will maintain it, even if it kills the men who are actually out there winning the war. Especially then, discipline and social order don't take a holiday because of a little Belgian frostbite." Greer pointed a steady finger toward the door. "Get back to your station, Lieutenant. Do not move him again. I cannot let a man die because of a sign on a door and your personal prejudice. If you touch that stretcher, I will have your bars and see you in front of a board. Now get out." Reeves turned and left the office. She did not go back to the ward. She walked straight to the communications tent. She bypassed the hospital's internal mail system. She sent a direct, urgent message to the 3rd Army Medical Oversight Office. She cited the 7 empty beds, the freezing temperature of the corridor, and the imminent death of a decorated non-commissioned officer. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the hospital gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. He walked into the ward unannounced. The room went silent. The clatter of medical trays stopped. Every nurse and orderly froze as the general moved toward the administration office. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the men on the floor. Patton stood before Greer. He did not shout. He studied the captain's polished shoes. "Captain Greer, how many empty beds are in the heated ward?" "7, General. We keep them for incoming casualties. And how many men are lying in that hallway?" "2, sir. The colored ward is at capacity. Is there a heater in that hallway?" "No, sir. It's an overflow area." "Is it cold enough to freeze water in a canteen?" "Yes, General, it is." "You believe your job is to protect a social hierarchy. You think the Army exists to validate your personal distastes. You are wrong. This is not Michigan. This is a war zone." Staff Sergeant Simmons has a chest wound. He earned that wound while pulling a white lieutenant out of a burning half-track. The German who shot him didn't check his race. The dirt he bled into didn't care about his hometown. Only you care. A man with a chest wound in a cold hallway, 7 warm beds empty, in my hospital, under my command. I do not leave a soldier to die in a hallway when I have warm beds sitting empty. These men are my soldiers. They belong to me. You have spent your day protecting empty furniture. You have protected your comfort while better men than you fought for their lives in a drafty alley. You have turned my hospital into a warehouse for your own ego. You have 2 options. You will go to that hallway right now. You will pick up those stretchers. You will carry them into the heated ward yourself. You will place them in the best beds you have. Then you will burn every sign in this building that mentions race. Avi. If those men are not in those beds in 5 minutes, I will strip you of your commission. I will send you to the front as a private. You can see how the hallway feels from the other side. Decide now." Greer's face went white. He didn't speak. He turned and stumbled toward the door. Captain Greer did not call for orderlies. He could not. Patton's eyes followed him like a marksman's scope, cold and unblinking. Greer gripped the freezing metal handles of Staff Sergeant Simmons' stretcher. His polished shoes, once his pride, slipped on the icy floor of the corridor. He heaved the weight of the wounded man alone. The smell of the hallway, wet canvas and stagnant, biting cold, filled his lungs one last time. As he crossed the threshold into the heated ward, the change in temperature was a physical blow. The air inside was thick with the scent of clean linen and medicinal heat. The soldiers in the room watched in a heavy, ringing silence. They saw an officer doing the manual labor of an orderly. They saw the man who had preached separation forced to bridge the gap with his own hands. Greer's breath came in ragged gasps as he lowered the stretcher onto the frame of a warm, elevated bed. Patton stood in the doorway, a silhouette of iron against the gray winter light. The general ordered the immediate removal of the ward's signs. Then he looked at Greer, whose hands were now stained with the sergeant's fevered sweat. Within the hour, Greer was transferred to a remote supply warehouse. Patton told him clearly, "You run a warehouse better than a hospital. At least boxes don't die in hallways." Staff Sergeant Calvin Simmons survived that night in the ward. He returned to Birmingham, Alabama in 1946. He spent the next 40 years as a master carpenter, building homes with the same steady hands that had once gripped a rifle in the Belgian snow. He died in 1994. Nurse Margaret Reeves returned to Boston and served as a head nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital for 4 decades. She never allowed a bureaucratic rule to interfere with patient care again. She kept the rescinded reprimand in a desk drawer until her death in 2005. Ernest Greer remained in the supply warehouse for the duration of the war. He returned to Grand Rapids in 1946 and worked in a furniture factory. He lived a quiet, bitter life, never quite understanding why Patton had chosen to humiliate him over a matter of policy. He died in 1978. He never spoke of Arlon, and he never changed his mind about the world. To him, the general had simply been a man who didn't understand the importance of order. Patton never mentioned the incident in his official memoirs. He viewed the event as a minor correction of a leadership failure. He only addressed it once in a private letter to his wife, Beatrice. He wrote, "I have no use for a man who values a clean floor over a soldier's life, especially a soldier who has already paid his price in blood." He kept moving toward the Rhine, leaving the cold hallway behind as a solved problem. Some historians argue that Patton's interventions into racial policy were not motivated by a belief in social equality, but rather by a purely pragmatic obsession with manpower and military efficiency. They suggest he viewed soldiers simply as assets to be maintained in fighting shape, rather than individuals with inherent civil rights. Others argue that his actions at the Arlon Hospital represent a rare and decisive rejection of systemic prejudice that far exceeded the military norms of the 1940s. They see it as a moment where he placed the warrior's code of survival above societal division. What is certain is that Patton's directive effectively desegregated his field hospitals months before the Army's formal shift, ensuring medical priority dictated care. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply filed a report and let the system handle it? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when dignity was denied and then restored, make sure you subscribe.